This week, I'll be trimming the porcelain bud vases thrown in my previous video. They've been sitting, wrapped up in plastic, for about 5 days now, and they're perfectly leather hard, although in some places they're just verging on being a bit too bone dry. But with porcelain, you can get away trimming it in that state. The first thing I need to do is to clean up all the tools I'll use for this process, as I'd just spent a day trimming this high iron pink stoneware clay, and I can't have any of it on the tools when I trim porcelain, as it can easily contaminate it, leaving a mark, potentially, that you'll never be able to remove properly. So this is a good opportunity to give them a thorough clean. Although the next time I do this, I'll also oil all the wooden handles, as they do feel like they're getting a bit dry. I also dry the metal blades with a cloth and never ever leave them out wet, especially the tungsten carbide tools. And once I've assembled all my gear, the process can begin. The first, the most basic step, is getting the piece properly centered on the wheel. There are a few ways of doing this, but initially I just use the lines on the wheel head to gauge how centrally it's placed. As I spin the pot, you'll see that there's a wider gap and a smaller gap between the line and the pot, and so by just getting this gap equal all the way around, your pot should more or less be in the center. The other technique I use is tap centering. This is when I strike the pot with my right hand whenever it passes on its widest point. And I use either my palm or the tip of my fingers. My left hand stays braced on the pot, and it helps guide the bud vase into the central position, as I can't tap beyond it. Essentially, it's a very rhythmic process, and it's one you'll learn through trial and error. And I recommend trying to learn this with a leather hard pot you just don't really care about, as inevitably you'll knock it too hard, leaving indentations and marks all over it. And that's another reason that when you're tapping like this, your clay needs to be firm enough, otherwise you'll end up just deforming the pot by whacking it. Another technique is to firmly hold a potter's needle with your wrists braced securely on the wheel tray. You spin the vessel and gently let the tip of the needle scratch where the pot swings out the furthest. You then push the pot inward from that scratch, and repeat the process again, carefully offering up the needle until it just makes contact. It's then pushed in again where that scratch is, and I'll keep doing this until when I touch the needle against the pot, it scratches around it continuously, even when held perfectly steady, like this. So that's centering, but before we can do this, I first coat some water over the base of the pot, especially around its edge. In fact, I never coat it directly over the middle, as doing so can cause the pot to stick down too firmly, and it can be really difficult to remove. It's then placed down and it's centered, using whichever of those 3 techniques you prefer. The water and the clay underneath quickly dry, but to secure the pot down in place even more firmly, I use a plastic kidney just to squash down this lower portion. And as you can see, if I try and wobble it from side to side, it doesn't move a budge. I then grasp my favourite turning tool right near the tip of the blade, resting my forearm on the tray and really tensing my hand so that the blade stays steady. I then start at the top and slowly work my way down, digging the corner of the tool in, as I find trimming away a lot of mass with a smaller point of contact tends to make for a more controlled process. If I tried to use the whole edge of the blade to do this, it would apply too much pressure to a large portion of the wall, and there's quite a high chance it would tear it off center. So when I do use the entire side of the blade, I'm actually pushing in less. You can see that the clay is on the drier side, as it comes off in small chips as opposed to long strands. As porcelain is such a smooth clay body to work with, as long as you're using very sharp tools, you can actually trim it when it's more or less completely bone dry, in a way that might be almost impossible to do with a grog stoneware, like that I normally use. And attempting to trim it this dry would cause the blade to chatter, leaving irregular indentations all the way around the surface. Once I feel like I've removed enough, I'll quickly run a flat metal edge over the surface to scrape away the trimming marks and to ensure the profile of the pot is nice and straight. As I'm trimming reclaim, which is clay that I've recycled, occasionally I'll find little cavities like this, from where a firm chunk of material was ripped out. And to fix these, all I do is dab some water over them and then firmly smear some extra porcelain into it. I then scrape over the surface once again until it feels smooth and flush. Then work on the top can begin. I insert my finger and feel under the wall. This way I know how much clay there is to trim away, and at the same time it blocks the tiny trimmings from filling the hole. And lastly, as I want this surface to be curved inward, I use a curved blade that's sympathetic to the form I want. Due to the overhang, if any small segments of clay do fall inside, it can be quite tricky to remove, and I tend to wait until they're completely bone dry before inserting a sponge on a stick to dislodge any trim piece that might have stuck to the internal wall, and then I shake the form upside down vigorously until I can no longer hear anything else shaking about inside. Once I'm finished with the turning tool, I then take a kidney with a curved edge and glide it over the section I just trimmed, smoothing it. I then slide a knife beneath the pot, catching it with my left hand, and then I scrape away any porcelain left over on the wheel, as I don't want that excess to embed itself back into the rim of this pot. And for this part, as I'm only trimming the base, I secure it in place with 3 lumps of soft clay, whereas previously I attached it with slip as I wanted to trim the entirety of the outside walls and the top, without any bits of clay like this getting in the way. But to help keep it pinned down in place a bit more firmly, I place this spinner tool on top, which I tap center, and by pressing through this I can apply some downward pressure, helping to keep the pot pinned in place. As any potter will know, it's incredibly infuriating when a pot you're centering suddenly comes loose and flies off to one side, so I do everything in my power to keep the vessel in place as I work. I begin by trimming away that ugly protruding ridge of clay, before once again just skimming over it, making it flush. Then the spinner can be removed and work on the actual base can begin, and this more or less always starts with a beveled edge being turned around the circumference of the base. Now, I talk about doing this a lot, but I thought a visual explainer like this might actually do a better job than what my words normally do. As you can see, this bevel makes it appear almost as if the pot is hovering slightly, as compared to the piece on the right, which is finished with a simple right angle, and visually this makes the pot feel much more grounded, as if it sinks into the table, and therefore, for me at least, it gives it connotations of being a heavier object. The beveled edge raises the pot up just ever so slightly, which causes the vessel to cast a band of shadow beneath it, making the object float and appear lighter. Beyond that, beveling the edge actually makes a base that's less likely to chip or be damaged with use, because as the point of contact, this beveled angle is less severe. It's much less likely to chip as it's moved and placed down. So, whilst this isn't vital to making a pot good, it does help alleviate some problems, both visually and functionally. And now with that edge beveled, I can start to trim the very bottom of the pot, removing the wiring off marks and altogether just making a neater surface. If I push down on the base with a finger, and I can feel as if there's quite a lot of clay left in the bottom, I'll use this hook turning tool to push down and trim further and remove just a bit more of the mass left in the bottom. I think this is my favourite bison turning tool of the lot. It's incredibly sharp, and the blade's shape means there's almost 3 different ways it can be used. There's its tip for more detailed work, there's the straight section for turning flat portions, and there's the corner, the hook, which is excellent for really digging into the clay when I want to remove a lot of material at once. Once I'm happy with the trimming, I'll burnish over these areas with the smooth, flat section of a metal kidney. And finally, I'll stamp it with my maker's mark, this being one of my newly made and fired ones, which you may have seen me carve in a video recently. They've all been glazed and fired now, so I'll probably have to remake that video, but this time showing the entire process from a lump of soft porcelain to the finished, fired object. Once stamped, that's the pot complete. So I'll take it and set it off to one side, placed onto a wooden bat, wiped clean of any burrs of clay or dirt, as I don't want anything sticking into the base I just so carefully finished. In these wintry months, it gets dark so early that I pretty much spend all my time making whilst using a spotlight like this. There are larger lights in my studio, a few fluorescent strips, but they hum and flicker, so I practically never use them. So, let's go through this process again, but from some different angles, and perhaps with some better lighting. I begin by gluing the pot down to the wheel with some slip and tap centering it, and at this stage I'm really watching the rim of the pot to make sure that's the part that's most centered. Sometimes the walls beneath might be offset slightly as they can distort as they dry, or even the process of wiring the pot off the wheel after being thrown can cause it to lean just a touch to one side. This vase was even drier, and you can almost hear it as the blade slices through the porcelain. At least it makes recycling it a bit easier, as these tiny scraps disintegrate in water in seconds. Generally, as I trim these lines up and down, I watch what my hands are doing in the mirror set in front of me, and this is the view I have. And from this angle, as opposed to looking down at my hands at work, I find it much easier to trim perfectly straight lines. As otherwise my view is a bit like this, it's slightly distorted, and so in many cases, when I trim pots, I'm actually watching what I'm doing through the mirror. Once the walls have been trimmed to about 3 or 4 millimeters thick, I move on to finishing the top, refining that curve whilst preventing a majority of those trimmings from falling inside. I don't want to make this top section too thin, as I fire to about 1300 degrees Celsius. If this overhang was wafer thin, there's a significant chance it could flop inward at those temperatures. I also refine this outer edge if it needs it, as throughout this process it can become quite rough and torn, yet as it's such a defining point on this vessel, it has to be perfect. I then flatten over the grooves left by the turning tool, and then the piece can be sliced off and work on the underside can begin. I always aim to finish the bases of my pots with the same degree of craftsmanship that's been applied to the rest of the vessel. Now, that might sound really obvious, but you'd be surprised by just how much the bases of handmade pots can be forgotten about or just finished to a substandard level, just because, as it's the bottom of the pot, it won't be the part that's on display. But pots normally aren't static objects. They're picked up and moved around and used. And as a potter, generally the first part of a pot I'll look at and inspect is the base. And it's through this section that I feel like I can really get to know a potter, as everyone finishes the bases of their pots slightly differently, perhaps even more so than the sides and the tops of their pots. Hence why I'm always so eager to take a look at them, as it shows how they conclude their vessels. It's their full stop. And it's also where potters normally choose to sign their work, and that symbol or mark or scratch is of equal interest. Then comes the beveled edge, and to trim this, I usually use one of my more blunt turning tools, as it leaves a smoother, almost burnished finish. Whereas my sharper tungsten carbide tools are so much sharper, they just tear through the porcelain, leaving a slightly rough finish. With this piece, I felt like I had left a bit too much in the base. So I took the flat edge of this hook tool and removed about 2 millimeters in total from the base, which I don't really like doing as it makes the pots shorter, but it's better being slightly shorter than having a base that's slightly too heavy. My left index finger here isn't just guiding the blade, it's also pushing down quite firmly, just like I was doing when using the spinner. Then, when I need to trim the very center of the pot, I transfer that pressure from my finger to the corner of the blade. That way there's always something pushing down. In this case it meant I had to retrim that beveled edge. And then once again, the last step is to push in my maker's mark, rocking it from corner to corner so it leaves a clear impression. The clay securing it in place is then taken away, and by just handling it for a second or two, I assess its weight and double check it for any other marks there might be. So here are 2 trimmed vessels, with a third that still needs to be turned, which, when placed side by side like this, shows you just how much these vessels are refined. In reality, it only takes a few minutes to trim each of these. Filming the process certainly makes it longer, but I'm still getting used to trimming porcelain, although I absolutely love it, as it's possible to achieve such fine and sharp edges. The next task will just be figuring out which glaze will look best on these. And with all that said, I'll end today's video with just a bit of housekeeping. I should, very soon, perhaps at the end of November, or the very beginning of December, restock my website shop for my annual winter drop. So if you would like to know exactly when that's going live, I'll be posting more regular updates over on my Instagram, or there's even a newsletter on my website you can sign up to, and I'll leave links to all of those places down in the description below. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching. It really means such a tremendous amount, and I cannot believe I've almost been making videos here now for 2 years. Time sure does fly. Anyway, thanks again, and I'll see you next week.